Story 1 by Jason Michaels. I'll never forget my first day on the job. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new beginning, but it turned into something I still can't fully understand. I was hired as a night security guard for a high-end office building in downtown Chicago. The pay was decent and the hours suited me. After all, who wouldn't want to get paid to sit around at night, right? My first shift started at 10 p.m. I arrived early, eager to make a good impression. The building was modern, all glass and steel, with a lobby that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The manager, Mr. Davis, met me in the lobby to give me a quick rundown. He was an older man, probably in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a stern expression that didn't quite match the warm handshake he offered. "Welcome aboard," he said, handing me a key card. "This will get you into all the restricted areas. You're responsible for the entire building, but it's mostly quiet at night. Just do your rounds every couple of hours and you'll be fine." It seemed simple enough, and I was confident that I could handle it. The first few hours were uneventful. I spent most of the time sitting in the security office watching the monitors. Nothing unusual, just a few people working late on the upper floors, typing away in their glass-walled offices. Around midnight, I decided to do my first round. The building was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you from all sides. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallways as I made my way from floor to floor, checking doors and making sure everything was locked up tight. On the 10th floor, I noticed something odd. The lights were flickering slightly, which seemed strange in such a modern building, and the air felt colder too, like someone had cranked up the air conditioning, but only on this floor. I made a mental note to report it to maintenance, then continued my round. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew that, but every time I passed by the large windows of the offices, I had the urge to glance behind me, just to make sure no one was there. But every time I looked, there was nothing, just empty hallways and darkened offices. I finished my round and returned to the security office. Everything seemed normal until I checked the camera feeds. The feed for the 10th floor was glitching, showing static for a moment before returning to normal. I wasn't sure if it was a technical issue or if something was wrong with the camera itself. It was late and my mind was playing tricks on me, so I decided to go back up to the 10th floor to check it out. I took the elevator, my heart pounding a little faster than before. When the doors opened, the floor was just as I'd left it, quiet, cold, and empty. I walked down the corridor, scanning the area with my flashlight, but saw nothing unusual. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint scraping sound like something being dragged across the floor. It was coming from one of the offices ahead. I hesitated, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe someone had stayed late and fallen asleep. Or maybe it was an animal that had somehow gotten inside the building. I approached the office slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. When I reached the door, I saw that it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking softly, and shined my light inside. The room was empty, but the window was open, letting in a draft of cold air. I walked over to close it and noticed a piece of paper on the desk, weighed down by a coffee mug. It was a handwritten note, the ink smeared as if someone had hastily written it down before leaving. The note simply said, "I'm sorry." My pulse quickened. Why would someone leave a note like that? I looked around the office again, but there was nothing else out of place. Just the open window and the strange, cryptic note. I closed the window, securing the latch, and left the office, trying to shake off the unease that was settling over me. As I continued my rounds, the building felt different, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. I kept hearing faint noises, the hum of the ventilation system, the occasional creak of the building settling, and that odd scraping sound, always distant but never fully gone. By the time I finished my rounds, I was on edge, every nerve in my body alert to the slightest sound. I made my way back to the security office, my thoughts racing. Had someone been in that office? And if so, why would they leave a note like that? I checked the cameras again, but everything appeared normal, except for the 10th floor camera, which was still glitching occasionally. I spent the rest of my shift in the office, too unnerved to do another round. When morning finally came, I handed in my report to Mr. Davis, mentioning the flickering lights, the open window, and the strange note I'd found. He listened quietly, nodding along. but didn't seem particularly concerned. "I'll have maintenance check it out," he said, his tone dismissive. "Sometimes the old wiring acts up. As for the note, it's probably nothing. Maybe someone had a rough night." I nodded, but his response didn't ease my mind. I left the building that morning feeling more unsettled than ever. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to that note, something I wasn't being told. The next night I came in for my shift, but the feeling of dread from the night before hadn't faded. I did my rounds as usual, but I was jumpy, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that I wasn't alone. And then, just after midnight, it happened again. I was on the 10th floor when I heard the scraping sound. This time it was louder, closer, and I couldn't ignore it. I followed the sound to an office near the end of the corridor, the same office where I'd found the note. The door was closed, but the light was on inside, casting a faint glow under the door. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, pushing the door open slowly. Inside, the room was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The note was gone. The coffee mug was still there, but the paper was missing, as if someone had come in and taken it after I'd left. I backed out of the office, my heart racing, and made my way to the elevator, deciding to finish my round later. As the elevator doors closed, I caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, maybe, or a figure, standing at the far end of the corridor. But when I blinked, it was gone, and the elevator was descending, taking me away from whatever was up there. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and dread. I couldn't stop thinking about the note, the noises, and that brief glimpse of something. When morning came, I quit. I didn't give a reason, just told Mr. Davis that I couldn't do it anymore. He didn't ask any questions, just nodded and wished me well. As I walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something terrible, something I couldn't fully understand. I still think about that note sometimes and what it might have meant. And I wonder if the next person to take the job will find it too. Story 2 by Alex Porter. It was supposed to be an ordinary first shift, a night job at a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. The place was quiet, almost too quiet, but I figured it was easy money. Hank, the manager, was a no-nonsense type of guy, middle-aged with a gruff voice and a serious demeanor. He gave me the rundown quickly, how to work the register, where to find the stockroom keys, and how to handle the occasional late-night customer. Before he left, he gave me a stern warning. "Don't get too comfortable," he said. "This place has a way of getting under your skin at night." I shrugged it off, thinking it was just his way of messing with the new guy. The first couple of hours were uneventful. A few locals came in to grab snacks or fill up their tanks, but by midnight the place was dead. I sat behind the counter trying to stay awake, flipping through a magazine someone had left behind. That's when I noticed the security monitor flicker. The feed showed the empty parking lot outside, but for a split second, it looked like there was a figure standing near the edge of the lot. I blinked, and it was gone. I chalked it up to my tired eyes playing tricks on me. Around 1 in the morning, a car pulled into the lot. It was an old sedan, paint chipping off the sides, and the headlights were dim. The driver, a middle-aged man with a weary look on his face, stepped out and came inside. He looked around the store for a moment before approaching the counter. "Excuse me?" he said, his voice low and raspy. "Do you know the quickest way to get to the interstate from here?" I hesitated, remembering Hank's warning, but there didn't seem to be anything particularly strange about the guy. "Yeah," I replied. "Just head straight down this road for about 10 miles, and you'll see the signs." The man nodded, muttering a quick thanks before turning to leave. But just as he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at me, his eyes dark and unsettling. "Be careful out here," he said, almost as if it was a warning, before stepping outside and driving off into the night. The rest of the night was a blur of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and I kept glancing at the monitor, half expecting to see that figure again. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to relax, the door creaked open. I looked up to see a woman standing in the entrance. She was in her late 30s, dressed in a heavy coat despite the mild weather. She walked slowly to the counter, her eyes never leaving mine. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you know how to get to the nearest hospital?" Her question caught me off guard. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned. "Do you need help?" She shook her head. "No, it's not for me, it's for someone else." "Well, the nearest hospital is about 20 minutes away," I said, giving her directions. "Just take the highway and follow the signs." She nodded, but there was something in her eyes that unnerved me, like she was holding back something important. She turned and walked out without another word, disappearing into the night. I watched her go, wondering what kind of situation would have her out here in the middle of the night, asking for directions to a hospital. When Hank came in to relieve me at dawn, I told him about the strange encounters. He listened quietly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, this place has a way of drawing in people who are lost in more ways than one," he said, almost to himself. "But you did good. Not everyone would have handled it as calmly as you did." As I drove home, the empty highway stretching out before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that those encounters weren't just random but connected somehow. And I couldn't help but wonder, who else might come looking for directions on another quiet night? Story 3. I never thought much of the warnings about my new apartment. I was a second-year college student, broke, and desperate for a place close to campus. The landlord was a strange old man, but the rent was cheap, and that's all that mattered. As he handed me the keys, he gave me a stern look and said, "Stay away from the basement." I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just some quirk, maybe an old superstition, or a way to keep tenants from wandering where they shouldn't. The first few nights in my new place were uneventful. It wasn't the most comfortable apartment with its creaky floorboards and the musty smell that lingered in the corners, but it was home. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a faint noise, almost like crying. At first, I thought I was imagining it or that it was just some weird echo from another apartment. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was real. It was faint, but there was definitely someone crying, and it was coming from beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a neighbor having a rough night. But the crying didn't stop. Night after night, it grew louder, more desperate. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate on my studies. The crying was consuming my thoughts. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Report it to the landlord? But what would I even say? On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and decided to investigate. I found myself standing in front of the basement door at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. As I descended, the smell hit me. Damp earth mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust. The air was thick and cold, and the sound of the crying was clearer now, coming from deep within the basement. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a small, rusted door at the far end of the room. The crying stopped as soon as I touched the doorknob, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had to know what was behind that door. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight flickering as it illuminated the cramped space inside. What I found was horrifying. The room was small, just a few feet wide, with a dirt floor and bare concrete walls. In the corner, chained to the wall, was a woman. She was emaciated, her skin pale and covered in bruises. Her eyes were closed, and she was so still that for a moment I thought she was dead. But then she moved, just slightly, and I saw her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. I rushed over, fumbling with my phone to call the police. I tried to talk to her, to reassure her that help was coming, but she didn't respond. She just lay there, barely conscious, her body broken and battered from what must have been weeks, if not months, of captivity. The police arrived quickly and the paramedics took the woman to the hospital. They told me she was in critical condition, but they didn't know if she would survive. As they carried her out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her wrists were bruised and bloodied from the chains, but there was something else. Carved into the flesh of her arm was a single word: Maria. I later learned that Maria had been missing for nearly a year. She was a student at a nearby college, just like me, until one day she disappeared without a trace. The landlord, that strange old man, was arrested. It turned out he had a history of violence, but no one ever suspected he could be capable of something like this. He denied everything, of course, but the evidence was overwhelming. They said Maria would never fully recover from the trauma she endured, but she was alive. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the sound of her crying in the dark. And I'll never forget the landlord's words when he handed me those keys. Stay away from the basement.